Well, hi there, my name's David Kowalik from Godwit Ministries, and today we're going to be looking at what the word flesh actually means from a biblical point of view. Now, there seems to be a lot of confusion around the differences between what the Bible calls the flesh and, on the other hand, the spirit. And I've already addressed this in 2 uploads concerning the difference between the offerings of Cain and Abel, which you can find in the links below. But today we're going to drill down into this subject and see just what the word flesh really means from a biblical point of view and how it contrasts with the spirit. Now, the first thing that we have to say about the flesh is that it is not merely about the body, and the spirit is not merely something that is ethereal. It is best to view these as parallel perceptions. Let me illustrate it with a story. Imagine an orphan girl in her late teens living on the streets of a large city. She leads a life punctuated by violence and homelessness and crime and broken relationships. And for her, every day is a desperate struggle for survival. And she's got nothing more to fall back on except her wit and her will to live. But all this is about to change, however, when a social worker comes to her one day with some extraordinary news. The social worker says to her, "You are not going to believe what I have to tell you. It turns out that you are not an orphan after all. It seems there was some kind of terrible mix-up in the hospital after you were born, and somehow you ended up as a ward of the state. But last week we discovered that your parents have been searching for you ever since you were born, and only now have they discovered your whereabouts. They've been living overseas, but they've never given up on you and have communicated with us their longing to reinstate you as a member of their family." The young woman, naturally, is dazed. She's amazed by this news, but the social worker has more. In fact, he goes on to say, "We have been informed that they've set up a bank account for you into which they've placed a large sum of money, and you're free to spend that any way that you choose. And in 1 month from now, they hope to meet with you, and they want you to know that they've always loved you completely and always will." What astonishing and potentially life-changing news this would be for this young woman. Suddenly, she is confronted with an entirely different story concerning who she is and what her life is really all about. Now, she is forced to choose between these 2 mutually exclusive realities. She can either embrace this new pathway, or she can turn her back on it and go on living unchanged in the life that she's always known. If she takes to heart the news that the social worker has announced, then the circumstances of her life will dramatically change. Obviously, she'll still have many challenges to work through before her parents arrive, but it would trigger a radical and positive transformation in her living conditions and perception of herself. But here's the thing. Her acceptance or rejection of this news will make no objective difference to the actual facts of either of these possibilities. Both the reality that she was born into and the reality presented to her by the social worker are objectively true. However, at a subjective level, it would make all the difference in the world. This news forces this young woman to decide between 2 very different and completely divergent pathways. And to me, these 2 pathways represent a useful analogy for understanding the difference between what the Bible calls flesh and spirit. Now, the way of flesh is like the first of these 2 pathways. It is the reality into which we were born, a life lived without reference to an authentic knowledge of God. The way of the Spirit, on the other hand, is like the second pathway, a parallel possibility that breaks into our lives through the truth of the gospel and by the power of the Holy Spirit. And hopefully this analogy can help us to understand and get our head around what flesh means. Now, before we go any further, we do first of all have to get past the confusion that surrounds the definition and the meaning of this word flesh. Unfortunately, this word has been used inaccurately and recklessly to merely refer to anything related to the physical realm, over and against the supposedly higher, invisible spiritual realm. And this kind of dualistic thinking about flesh and spirit has, unfortunately, a very long history with plenty of precedents. In church history, there are many accounts of saints and mystics exercising extreme states of bodily deprivation in the hope of producing some kind of spiritual outcome. You know, pole sitting, hair coats, beds of nails, starvation, mutilation of the body, just to name a few. But as we shall see, the effort to become spiritual by putting down the body is, ironically, very much a feature of the way of the flesh. These inaccurate notions concerning flesh and spirit are by no means confined to ancient history. I can well remember in my youth, if a girl used too much makeup or a boy spent too much time pumping weights at the gym, they could be accused of being in the flesh. Indeed, anything physical, especially anything relating to the body, was regarded as fleshly and to be shunned. And yet, the New Testament rarely uses the word flesh in this way. In fact, it warns against this kind of thinking. So let's look at the physical body and the fallen human mind and how they are two different things. Confusion about the word flesh is completely understandable given the fact that the Greek word sarx, translated as flesh, has several usages, and sometimes flesh is used merely to refer to the physical body of either a human being or an animal. When Jesus appeared to his disciples after the resurrection and he said to them, "Touch me and see, a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see I have," that was in Luke 24:39, he was literally referring to his physical body. Other times, flesh is used to speak collectively of a particular group of people, or indeed to the entire human race. When Jesus said to Simon Peter in Matthew 16, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood," he was, of course, speaking of all humanity. However, these usages of the word flesh have little to do with the specific usage that we're going to be concerning ourselves with here. Now, it's also true that the word flesh, sarx, is occasionally used to refer to the natural physical desires for food and sex and security. Paul uses flesh in this way when he speaks of gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts, Ephesians 2 verse 3. Naturally enough, this kind of usage has led many people to believe that flesh is nothing more than the lowest form of our humanity, focused on our biological needs, a kind of vulgar, self-centered and unspiritual version of ourselves. And while this is certainly one of the meanings of the word, it is seldom used, maybe 3 or 4 times in the whole New Testament. Now, this may come as a surprise, but this has more to do with our widespread misreading of the word rather than its more common usage in the New Testament. All right, so leaving aside the references to the physical body, the New Testament mostly uses the word sarx, flesh, to refer to the fallen human mind and its grand aspirations to drag itself out of darkness and into some kind of, do-it-yourself spiritual enlightenment. Flesh, when used in this sense, covers everything from our ambitions for self-fulfillment to all the things that we do in an attempt to gain a sense of self-justification. The way the translators of the New International Version of the Bible use the phrase human limitations to render the word flesh in Romans 6:19 captures this meaning perfectly. Flesh, used in this way, is referring to the limited perspective and self-interested bias of our corrupted humanity. Now, corrupt though the flesh may be, it can be, and here's the thing, it very often is oriented towards things transcendent and noble. Indeed, many of the better parts of human history and philanthropic enterprise owe their existence entirely to the ambitious initiatives of the flesh. And this is where things can get, a little bit tricky, because the high-minded aspirations and the apparently honourable actions of the flesh have all the appearances of being spiritual. Indeed, historically, flesh has been the initiator of nearly every kind of pagan spirituality and religion. And this makes perfect sense, given that apart from a revelation from God, humanity has nothing else upon which to rely for moral guidance and so-called spiritual progress. However, no matter how high-minded and honourable the flesh may be, it's utterly incapable of grasping the reality it so earnestly seeks. Jesus said, "Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit." John 3 verse 6. There can be no crossover between the two, for flesh can never produce a truly spiritual effect. All right, so where did this all come from? Where did this all start? Now, the origin of our limited humanity goes all the way back to the time when Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden. You can catch up with that story in Genesis 3:23 to 24. In that story, we have a metaphoric way of describing their deliberate rejection of God and their consequential distorted view of their place in the world, a view which we have all corporately and individually assimilated since. The Apostle Paul describes the results of this distorted view in his letter to the Romans, saying, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened." Romans 1:21. Now, in this state of futility and darkness, we are constantly restless and desperate. And it sets up a sense of spiritual anxiety, which in turn creates a determination to regain the security that the garden once offered to us. To achieve this end, the flesh has two main strategies at its disposal. One of these strategies simply aims to reconstruct a semblance of Eden through an accumulation of possessions or power or pleasure, or all three. It's a futile attempt to fill up the aching black hole of meaninglessness with such unsatisfying morsels as personal achievement or mind-altering narcotics or illicit sex or an accumulation of money and any number of other soul sedatives. This strategy can only hope to temporarily numb the pain of emptiness, and it's often abandoned in favour of another and much more sophisticated religious strategy instead. This second option usually involves setting up a system of ever-increasing spiritual attainments that enables us to measure our progress towards spiritual transcendence. This creates a dualistic view of the world. And you see, the flesh has an instinctive perception that God, whoever he, she, or it may be, is perfect and pure and somewhere high above our fallen humanity. This idea generates a dualistic view of the world that sets up well-defined boundaries between things that are considered spiritual and holy over and against things that are considered material and ordinary. And this system radically divides heaven from earth and soul from body and mind from emotions. And then alongside this, the flesh also invents ways and means of bridging these gaps. Usually this takes the form of gaining special knowledge, or keeping a moral code, or keeping a code of ethics, or observing religious rituals. And all these represent a kind of stairway to heaven. And every step on this stairway is a step closer to God and a level closer to spiritual security. Now, usually these steps require the suppression of the natural world and of bodily desires, and while accentuating the higher invisible aspects of our humanity, such as the mind or the spirit. And the goal of these systems is to shrug off the humble confines of our material existence, our body, and even earth itself, thereby allowing us to enter a higher plane of celestial perfection, unsullied by the grubbiness of mortal humanity. Now, naturally, this all lends itself to a spiritual hierarchy overseen by those who have already attained superior levels of holiness. With a little bit of organisation thrown in with a sacred text and a priest or two, and guess what? Before you know it, you've got yourself a whole new religion. But here's the thing, this kind of religion is not limited to people with a spiritual bent. Atheists and agnostics are just as likely to adopt philosophies that place, for example, rationalism or scientific logic over what they deem to be lower aspects of our humanity, such as emotion or desire or faith even. And despite its non-religious packaging, these philosophies have all the hallmarks of a de facto religion. In the place of the cathedral, we have the university. The priest is changed out for the professor, and the sacred text is put aside for the latest scientific theory. Now, the cult of scientism is well and truly established in the West, in case you haven't noticed already. Now, all these systems rely on what theologians would call natural theology. Natural theology is a construct of the flesh, which relies entirely upon human observation and deduction to reach upward to the heavens. It is a hopelessly optimistic and ultimately futile attempt to decipher the dimensions of divinity with nothing more than the rudimentary resources of human reason. And to me, this is as pointless as trying to measure interstellar space with a piece of string. Logically, however, the only way a finite human being could genuinely engage with infinite truth is by a revelation from beyond the boundaries of human thought, a revelation that comes to us by a deliberate and graceful act of God. As the Apostle Paul has it, the person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness and cannot understand them because they are discerned only through the Spirit. That's in Paul's letter 1 Corinthians 2:11-14. In other words, it takes God to make God known. And unless the Holy Spirit comes to us with a word from beyond the limitations of our humanity, then our knowledge will remain hopelessly tethered to the stake of natural theology. The Apostle Paul warned his readers to steer clear of this kind of self-made spirituality, saying, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and on the elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." That's in his letter to the Colossians 2, verse 8. Now, Paul, while rejecting this kind of dualism, nonetheless sees a clear distinction between the realm of the flesh and the realm of the Spirit, and he contrasts them. And he differentiates between these two realms by using contrasting language, such as flesh versus spirit, as we are doing right here. For instance, Romans 8, 4-6, or law and promise, Romans 4, 13-14, or law and faith, Galatians 2:16, or Hagar over and against Sarah, Galatians 4, 22-24, or Old Covenant and New, 2 Corinthians 3, 6-14, or Sinai and Zion, Galatians 4:25, or Jerusalem above and Jerusalem below, Galatians 4:25-26, or slave and free, Galatians 4:30, first Adam and second Adam, 1 Corinthians 15, 45-49, or Adam and Christ, 1 Corinthians 15:22. And that's just an example of the kind of contrasting language that Paul uses. Yet in all these analogies, the line that Paul draws is not between material and ethereal things so much as it is between parallel perceptions of reality. As someone once said, where you choose to stand will determine what you see. And flesh and spirit view the world from two very different vantage points. The vantage point of the flesh is entirely centered in the self and is therefore self-referential, self-justifying, self-made, self-absorbed, self-important, self-pitying, self-conscious, self-confident, and its shadow self-loathing, and overall just plain good old-fashioned selfish. The vantage point of the Spirit, however, is a gracious revelation from beyond the boundaries of human insight and can only be received as a gift beyond human control. Therefore, these two positions are mutually exclusive and in opposition to one another. There can be no overlap between them. It is either one or it is the other. And this is a truth that is persistently and frequently restated throughout the entire saga of the Bible, over and over again. And in the next few months, I hope we'll have the opportunity to explore this contrast between these parallel realities, because just as real as they are in the scriptures, they affect us right here, right now. Thanks for listening.